Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, of a very special guest. His name is David Smith. He works with the Bad Press podcast, also Hemispheric Press. I'll put links to his work and his podcast, but this will be our third show. Our first show was about Andre Puharich. I heard him through the Biblical Hitman, and I didn't know much about Puharich. I researched it. Everybody should really know about Puharich. I think he's a very significant figure, somebody in the new age and kind of esoteric movement is a way to put it. Dulles Brothers, we did the first show and we've been trying to get this one done. I've been busy all day. Sorry for the late start again, but it's going to happen. So the Dulles, I'm trying to remember, maybe David can remember where we left off, but the Dulles Brothers were giants. One was, for people who don't know, one was Secretary of State under Eisenhower. The other is the head of the CIA in 53, starts MK Ultra. But they also had, I can't remember, it was either their cousin or somebody's daughter was also involved in one of the administrations who I can't remember. Probably David knows better than that. But they were really up there until, important until Kennedy fired Dulles in 1961. Allen, Allen, but they go way back. Like we did the show, like their involvement all the way back World War One, pre World War II, all the way leading up. But we can pick it up where we left off. So, David, welcome back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me. Excited to be here. Glad we're able to. I know I've been busy as well, so glad we're able to sit down.
Me too. Do you remember where we left off? Maybe you can pick it up and just take the helm and go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. We left off with Guatemala and kind of the Operation PB Success that Alan Dulles and the CIA ran down there to oust Jacobo Arbenz and put Colonel Castillo Armas into kind of the presidency, and how that sparked a civil war in Guatemala that lasted for over 30 years and kind of culminated with a genocide against the indigenous Maya during the administration of Rios Montt, which was in the early 80s during kind of Reagan. So anyways, this was kind of like the reason that Guatemala is important also for wider Latin American Cold War history is it was the blueprint for what would happen in Cuba a few years later, after Castro had taken power through, his the Cuban Revolution. And so the same people that you see organizing Operation PB Success in Guatemala are going to be organizing the Bay of Pigs. So it is, the Dulles crew. And we talked a couple about those names, and there's so many names that it's tough to get a bunch of them straight. But these major figures from the CIA in the 50s and into the 60s are going to be involved down there in everything that happens with Cuba. And the reason that Cuba is so important is because I think to understand, it's a really solid place to begin to try and tackle some JFK research and what happened during the JFK administration, and particularly what happened between JFK and Alan Dulles that led to, when you mentioned that he was, fired from the CIA, the Bay of Pigs and the whole issue of what to do with Castro down in Cuba, really paved the path for that to happen. And that's going to be central to a lot of kind of what happens in the CIA also in the early 60s. And, the anti-Castro Cuban movement is very, very prominent down there, in New Orleans and stuff. So we'll get into some of that stuff. And that puts us like mid 50s kind of with Guatemala. Eisenhower administration. During the Eisenhower administration, like Dulles and the CIA really ran the show, and they had helped Nixon get into the vice presidency. And so early in Nixon's career, he had actually been antagonistic towards the Dulleses. I think it was the Marshall Plan. The Dulleses were in support of the Marshall Plan to rebuild Europe and to invest a lot of money into rebuilding the infrastructure and restarting trade and all of that, kind of thing after after the war, and Nixon was actually opposed to, spending so much money, and wondered why we should be kind of involved in, European affairs, kind of that classic, I guess, isolationist, Republican mentality. But what the Dulles actually did is they brought him over to Europe and took him on a tour and kind of courted him. And they actually got him on board with the Marshall Plan and got him on board with their plan to rebuild Europe. And that was in the, late kind of after the war, late 40s. And as a result of kind of that relationship, they, I think especially John Foster had an influence, not saying he was the only reason that Nixon got into Eisenhower's vice presidency, but they were, cultivating that relationship. And so that relationship with Nixon continued all the way through the Eisenhower administrations. And obviously Nixon would run against JFK in the 1960 election. So that's why that relationship is really interesting, because they had, like I said, the Dulles and the CIA were largely running the show. We talked about how they had overthrown the Mossadegh in Iran. Guatemala happened. There were, various kind of conflicts around the world where the CIA was, either pursuing covert or, just out in the open action against foreign leaders. And Nixon was a part of that. He was involved in, those presidential briefings where Eisenhower was also, in support of these policies as well. But as they go into, like, as it transitions out of the Eisenhower administration into JFK, they had, when we'll talk about the Cuban Revolution, but that, I just wanted to point that out, that relationship with Nixon was they were pretty close, with Nixon starting in the late 40s, kind of through the late 50s. So the primary, the primary issue of the 1960 presidential election between Nixon and JFK was the issue of Cuba and the Cuban Revolution. And so Castro, I think on January 1st, 1959, declared, that they had won the revolution and had taken control of the government. And they had overthrown Fulgencio, or Castro and his, guerrillas, and Che Guevara had overthrown the Fulgencio Batista regime, who had been very cozy with the United States. Very cozy with United States corporate interests. We talked about United Fruit Company in Guatemala. There was a similar setup with different corporate interests in Cuba. It supplied the United States sugar, which is, a huge deal to, companies like Pepsi or Coca-Cola, different, corporate giants like that. And then there was also, they had turned under Batista. He had allowed, the mob to operate rather freely and open up casinos, open up brothels. And so there was an organized crime interest as well as a United States corporate interest in Cuba. And so this is,
I always think of that Godfather scene in Godfather 2, where like the corporate interests and the mob interests are there before the overthrow. And I think it's a really good, like, symbolic representation of that era, the pre-Castro era. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's perfect.
Lansky, like Mo Green, I think is it Green, or who's the guy who plays the Lansky figure?
Yeah, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it reminds me of. I was looking into this the other day. It was something called the Havana Conference, and the Havana Conference was a meeting of the different organized crime families in Havana. And what had happened is, I think it was Meyer Lansky, or I forget there was one of the, like, mob bosses, like the head. I mean, he was basically the head of the head of the families, had been arrested on charges. And then the FBI had contacted him as a part of, I think it was like Operation Underworld, to provide intelligence about German activity on the eastern seaboard of the United States. And so they were worried about German sabotage. And yeah, I think, is it
Lucky
it was one of
Luciano,
the
I think, was involved in the docs. I think he was one of them.
yeah, it was an Italian. It was and so that's what I forget. There was two.
Johnny Rosselli was around there,
Yeah, I
and
think it was
yeah,
Luciano. I
Luciano,
think you're
yeah.
right about Luciano. And then Lansky, I think, went down to the Havana conference. But it was interesting because Luciano was allowed to be released from prison for providing intelligence to the FBI, and he was deported, quote unquote. He was given like a hero's send off back to Italy. And then after kind of running things from Italy for a while, they called a conference down in Havana to basically reorganize organized crime in the United States. And he was kind of declared, I think it would have been Luciano was declared kind of the head of the families. And then you have, obviously the interest of Santo Traficante as kind of like getting Cuba. And so anyways, just Havana was a hotbed and a centralized location of organized crime. And so when you hear the mob tied into JFK assassination conspiracy, or truth finding, whatever you want to call it, the mob is also connected into Cuba. So Cuba comes up everywhere. But anyways, Castro overthrows them. Obviously, the United States is very opposed to Castro. He's not super communist to begin with, but given what he did, it was the only place for him to go was the Soviet Union. And so he quickly allied, and they became more of, and there were communist influences in his movement.
Guevara's a stone cold communist.
Yeah, that's what, and that's, he teamed up with him, and Guevara was, I think we mentioned it, he was in Guatemala with Arbenz.
That's right.
And so he
shows up all over the place. He shows up in Congo, Angola.
Mhm.
He really was an international figure. I think he's from Argentina originally, like what his real name was. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was a doctor, and he traveled through the really just kind of these very remote villages throughout Latin America before kind of ending up in Guatemala, and then Guatemala really radicalized him, and so he began to pursue kind of international guerrilla communism full throttle. But they were all meeting in Mexico City, and that's what's interesting is Castro was a student. He was a law student. He was not, and he was the son of a plantation owner. So he was one of these people that kind of came from a bit of a wealthier class. He was trained, or he was schooled at really nice Jesuit institutions within Cuba, and he tried to challenge the Batista regime legally, and then obviously they strong armed him out of that. He participated in a coup attempt against Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, and that was defeated. And after he got kind of like blacklisted by all of these different governments, he kind of ends up in Mexico City, and they plan the Cuban Revolution out of Mexico City. And it's a really small force, but they're able to just they almost lose in the beginning, and they have to go to, I think it's the Sierra Madre Mountains, and they regather, and then they take Cuba.
That's in the population of Havana is mostly Western Havana. Cuba. It's mostly Western. So the Sierra Madres is the far east part of Cuba, and then they slowly made their way. There wasn't Batista didn't have a lot of sympathy with the population. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, and that's what he was extremely unpopular, which is one of the reasons why Castro was able to do it with a pretty limited force, is because it was, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if, like I said, he even if he was communist, he may have underplayed that a bit in order to like get to power and then actually kind of enact a lot of those policies. So anyways, that's the most major issue, because obviously Cuba is 90 miles off the coast of Florida. They begin to ally with the Soviet Union, and this becomes a major geopolitical conversation. And Dulles, behind the scenes with Nixon and the rest of the Eisenhower administration, are planning an Operation PB Success like operation down in Cuba. And so they are trying to figure out, but since there's a presidential election happening, and it happened in 1959, they're kind of in this transition window waiting to see, if Nixon wins the presidency, then they're just going to go ahead with, the plan that they have. and Nixon was much more, I guess, aggressive. He wanted to take a much more aggressive action and probably would have supported U.S. Conventional military forces on the ground. So they're planning something through the CIA, but with support of the military. And then there was actually what Dulles ends up doing is he starts playing both sides of the presidential election. And so then you get into, it's a really interesting, like the social networks in Washington and the Kennedys' relationship with kind of like the circles of power. It's like the Kennedys were obviously in those networks, like they, were different, being Irish Catholic and not necessarily being, kind of from super traditional money. But the point of that is JFK and Dulles were in the same circles, and Dulles had met JFK, previous to the presidential election, and he had different contacts with both JFK and with Robert Kennedy, kind of throughout the early processes of the election. And so he would actually go and give John F. Kennedy briefings about CIA's plans, or kind of like what they were, their policy positions towards places like Cuba. And it came up in a debate, in a presidential debate. It was the final presidential debate. And JFK was actually able to appear tougher on Cuba than Nixon was, because Nixon wasn't allowed to disclose that they had been planning, that the Eisenhower administration had been planning covert action in Cuba. And so JFK was like, we need to go, like Castro needs to go. We need to, fight communism in Cuba. And then Nixon actually, he had to take kind of a contrary position to that. And that election was notoriously very, very close. And so, that response and that perceived weakness in the debate, because he had to kind of hold his tongue, because of Allen Dulles, may have impacted that election some. And so I think because of that, you have JFK representing this new frontier and kind of this new politics, but he was still very involved in the politics of, the 50s Cold War. And, he was dealing with Allen Dulles, and he was looking to transition from the old guard into the new guard, but he wasn't ready to just replace everyone at the CIA immediately. And so and I think perhaps some of that is because it was like he recognized the value of what kind of Allen Dulles did. And Richard Nixon was very mad at Allen Dulles for briefing, JFK on, CIA opinions towards Cuba. So anyways, that sets the stage for the Bay of Pigs. But before we get into like the official JFK administration, Dulles immediately antagonizes JFK by assassinating Patrice Lumumba down in the Congo. And so he did it, the CIA assassinated him in the transition period between Eisenhower, before JFK was inaugurated. So
right, it was 3 days before. I think it's January 17th, 1961. So it's like a direct shot across his, like, the bow or whatever you want to call it. Yeah.
And that set the tone, because JFK was a huge fan of Lumumba, and JFK was, known for meeting with, African Democratic independence, like leaders. And I think as far as, especially like post-war, throughout many parts of Africa, there were these democratic independence movements springing up, kind of anti-colonial, but pro-democracy, wanting to develop their own countries. And obviously a lot of the United States corporate interests see that as a threat. We had, incredible mining interests in the Congo. We had, incredible economic interests there. So when they talk about
natural resources are vast, they're just incalculable. Yeah, it's huge.
Yeah. And so when they talk about nationalizing that makes, people like Allen Dulles, who was Sullivan and Cromwell, we talked about that last time, Sullivan and Cromwell was representing all of those companies that were in the Congo.
Sorry to interrupt, but in the time between our last show and the present show, I interviewed really one of the great modern historians, Alfred McCoy. and he just published a book called, I don't know if you're aware of this, but it's called Cold War on Five Continents. And it's shows this tapestry of post-war that Dulles brothers are involved in, of so many upheavals. And it was like a World War II kind of sequence. The Cold War itself involved millions and millions of deaths, whether it's Indonesia, the Civil War in Greece, like we mentioned, Cuba, Iran, Vietnam as well. Just upheavals all this time. It's just like incredible destabilization, and this kind of, these decolonial and colonial things were like intermediaries between the Soviet bloc or the communist bloc and the US. So lots going on with the Dulles brothers.
Yeah, and that strikes at the heart of, I think, what the JFK presidency represented, and what JFK, kind of represented as a political figure in terms of foreign policy is, not to like idealize or like, glamorize, but he was really looking to, like I said, support people like Patrice Lumumba. And he was looking to, kind of, he was very anti-communist. And so anytime that there was, what he like perceived to be a communist threat, then he, took a pretty aggressive tact towards it. But if they were democratic national movements, then he was looking, it felt like his foreign policy was much more, kind of hands off towards those interests. And that was the exact opposite of the way that Allen Dulles and Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles had, operated in the 50s. So it was a direct, this was always going to be a major point of conflict, in the JFK administration, because no matter who he had, even if he had fired everyone and tried to hire new people, it's like the interests of the Dulles brothers and the interests of these corporate interests and, elite interests throughout the entire military structure and the government structure. It's like, there's no way to eradicate, all of that. You can't just replace it with new people. And so this is kind of the tension he faced. So Lumumba, it deeply affected JFK. Like, there's a very famous picture of, I think, JFK receiving the phone call that Lumumba had been assassinated, and he just has his head in his hands. And it's, like you said, 3 days before. I'm not even sure that he learned about it actually until a couple months after, because Lumumba had been imprisoned and then he had been transported to a rival territory. And I guess the CIA themselves, like, it wasn't like they, shot him in the street. They handed him over to, his political rivals, and the political rivals were, I think they had CIA code names. So
I think it's been figured out. Yeah. It wasn't known at the time, but they figured out there was like a CIA handler there. Yeah.
And that's what, I mean, the way that news traveled, it was still, still possible back in the 60s for him to not know. So I think even February 13th, so that was basically a month after his inauguration. And so that's like I said, just for a month, and to have, kind of something like that happen, it's going to immediately create friction between him and Allen Dulles. And very soon after that is going to be, so later that year is going to be the Bay of Pigs.
This marked the beginning of all his troubles. It started right from the beginning for Kennedy, right for JFK. Like, he was right in the thick of it. He was right in the jackal's lair or something like that, right from the beginning.
And that's what there was. I mean, there were people within his inner circle. I think it was Arthur Schlesinger, the Harvard historian or journalist, whatever kind of, I think he was a historian. He was close to JFK in terms of kind of like being one of these new frontier new intellectual influences. And people like him were trying to persuade JFK to not keep Allen Dulles on at the CIA. But he, like I said, he was looking to kind of transition, and he was looking to kind of work with the old guard and try and, get them moving in a different direction. And they were just as stubborn as could be. So it's interesting, I don't know if anything completely different happens if, like, he, doesn't hire Allen Dulles on at the head of the CIA. But anyways, they go through. So the Bay of Pigs, we talked about Cuba, Castro is in charge. Now the covert action that the CIA decided to pursue, like I said, it was, trying to emulate Guatemala. They train a force of Cuban exiles, so people who had fled the Castro regime, whether it was because they had their livelihoods threatened or it was, they were political targets. Castro went on, a huge killing spree, imprisonment spree, immediately assuming power as, a leader does after a coup. And so all of these people flee to Florida for the most part. That's a very, the Cuban population in Florida is, pretty well known. But they all go there, and down there's the CIA station. It's JM Wave. And you have they're training these Cuban exiles and arming them in order to land at Cuba and retake the government. Now, this plan was purposefully bad by the CIA.
That's what I've heard. So you had take that position too. They intentionally bungled it. Okay.
And this is kind of the opinion of the Devil's Chessboard and David Talbot. So I'm kind of leaning towards that. So it might be, some source bias, but the way that he painted it made a lot of sense. Is that what they were trying to do was force the president's hand to approve a more conventional military operation. And so they were trying to get these Cuban exiles onto the beach. And then once they were on the beach, they thought that JFK would cave when they said, hey, actually, we need to, pull the warship down there, and we need to back up and provide, support, both air support and, I think some land support as well. And so they set up this plan. I forget how many exiles they have. It's a decent bit. But Castro,
it's in the couple thousands, if I remember correctly. I'll have to look that up. Let me see.
And yeah, so what they're trying to do is trying to kind of stir up unrest as they go, and try to get the Cuban people behind them and let the force kind of, perhaps organically grow and let that, kind of snowball into, a successful confrontation with Castro's forces. But Castro had a pretty, he was, I think Guevara was probably the one who was organizing a lot of the military, but they had some serious military, forces on there. It wasn't like, they had a few thousand soldiers. It was, they had tens of thousands of, and
right.
were
so I think it's according to Wikipedia, it's 1,500 on the American side, and then the Cuban military just overwhelming force, right? 25,000.
Yeah.
Plus another couple 100,000 militias. So
yeah, that's the civil reserves that they had were, and it was still so fresh from the revolution that the Cuban people were still very willing to listen to an anti-imperialist, anti-US intervention message. Because we didn't talk about the Spanish-American War and the history between the Spanish-American War and Bautista, but essentially the United States military was very involved in organizing politics down there.
Just a recommendation for you or other listeners. I interviewed I think she's an NYU professor. Her name was Farrar, and she wrote a book called Cuba, An American History. So it's very interesting. So it's looking at Cuba from, Uncle Sam's kind of point of view, and how important Cuba was as a linchpin for colonialization.
Oh yeah,
it's always at the center of a lot of stuff. The conflict, Spanish-American War, and then I interviewed her, and then she went on and she won the Pulitzer Prize. So good.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I'll have to look at that.
Listen to the guy. It's she's super great. It's a great book. It's readable. It's accessible. It's not doesn't have that kind of dry academic feel, and it's just got a lot of really interesting facts. It's really great. Let me see if I can pull up the book title for everybody.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can listen to the interview on William Ramsey Investigates.
Yeah. And that's what, I'll be the first to admit that I'm not.
I learned a lot from that book. It's really good. I didn't know a lot of the stuff she was talking about.
Yeah. But that's what, Cuba, that was the sugar plantations that Spain, operated down in, Cuba was massively important to the transatlantic trade. I mean, it was especially in the rum trade. They would send the sugar, Spain would send it up to a lot of times like New England, who would make the rum, who would send it over to, over to Great Britain, who would then use, rum as basically a currency to trade. And so, I mean, that the rum trade and, that the Spanish were making enormous amounts of money. And it was obviously some of the most vicious forms of slavery in the hemisphere.
Yeah,
Cuba was next to
sugar
Brazil.
farming is really rough. It's really
Yeah.
hard to do, like with Manuel Label. Here's the title: in American History, Cuba and American History, and it's Ada Ferrer. It's like a 4.6 on Amazon, but it went on to win the Pulitzer Prize. So you can look it up in my archives, just Ferrer. People check it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well worth your time if you love history.
Yeah, I will definitely be. I'll be listening to that.
It's only $2.99 on Kindle, guys. Get your books.
Wow.
Yeah,
that's really cool.
Yeah, it's cool.
And then we mentioned the Spanish-American War, and that was Teddy Roosevelt and the Rough Riders. They go and they quote unquote liberate Cuba, but that was just opening. It's getting the Spanish finally relinquish Cuba, and then we get the corporate interests, and we get to kind of have it in our sphere of influence. And so tons of history, really, really fascinating. But it gets to, so like I said, the people of Cuba were, they had been under the Spanish until 1898. They had been in the sphere of influence of the United States up until 1959. And so they were still, obviously, I think, in the next few years, Castro would really like show his true colors, and people would see kind of the, some of the atrocities of his regime. But early on, I don't know if, I still think, the idea of a popular revolution in favor of the United States sweeping through Cuba was not realistic. And so they land on the beach. They try initially. So they did send planes to bomb the airstrips, and they actually knocked Cuba down to about, I think, like 7 or 8 planes. But they didn't completely wipe out the Air Force. And because of that, the Cubans are able to sink one of the ships that the CIA provided that was providing logistical support. And so they cut off all communication and supplies from the people that landed off the beach pretty immediately. And so as that happens, and they knew exactly, kind of where the United States was going to land. They had set up, forces to meet them. And so immediately, the CIA starts calling back to Washington. And this is, so I think Richard Bissell really oversaw a lot of this, the Bay of Pigs. And he was the deputy director to Dulles. But obviously Dulles was very, very involved in the planning of the Bay of Pigs. And,
Bissell ended up getting fired too with Dulles, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. And he, and like I said, there's so many other names that get involved. I should have, just a list of
Shackley, the blonde ghost, is over there. There's the
Yes.
head of JM Wave was a really interesting CIA agent whose name
Yes.
escapes me now. I think Phillips was involved, who was also involved in Guatemala. Atlee Phillips.
That was the one
David
that I was
Atlee
trying
Phillips.
to think of, yeah.
He was kind of the propaganda guy. He's supposedly a propaganda specialist. These are like the known names, but and the biggest CIA outpost at the time was at right next to, it was Mongoose, I think was the operation they called it.
Yeah,
and part of the University of Miami or something. Like they had some adjunct to it.
That's that station. It's like the JM Wave station, and I think Frank Sturgis is involved. So
David Ferry supposedly running arms all the time, and a CIA agent, and
then you'll see the Watergate burglars.
And also Hunt, E. Howard Hunt. So they're all there. Yeah, they're all there.
And that's what Barker is involved in. And they're involved at different stages and in different kind of plots. There's a million CIA, plots against Cuba in the early 60s. But they go, so just to finish Bay of Pigs, they land on the beach, they cut off logistical support, they go back to Washington, and they go to the president and they say, hey, we need more air support. We need, you to send either, the Air Force or the Navy planes in there, and provide cover. And then we need to, get more forces down there to support them. And they expected, once the troops were on the beach, that JFK would approve it. And that's what, I guess that was like Dulles' calculation, is the reason that the planning of it. I don't think he necessarily thought that force of 1,500 was going to succeed in overthrowing Castro, but I think he did believe that JFK would cave to sending in, more support. And JFK, to his credit, did not cave. And he did not provide
I think they
support.
were used to Eisenhower just rubber stamping everything they said. Like,
Yeah,
okay,
and that's
all right. Eisenhower just like, you want to throw that, do it. And this
yeah,
was
and
different. And I also,
yeah,
one other thing is E. Howard Hunt was very close to these guys. So he wasn't some kind of like set aside. He was doing the training and shoe ending and stuff. So he had personal connections to a lot of those anti-Castro Cubans leading up to Bay of Pigs and after. I think you wrote a book about it. There's a book about him and them.
Yeah. And he's and then Hunt actually wrote, it was like his son interviewed him about kind of all of the stuff with Cuba and JFK and kind of Watergate and some of this different stuff. And he had some interesting things to say. I mean, it's all, it's spooked out, but still he, begins to at least open the lid on, some of the stuff that was happening down there. So JFK, all of the, the Bay of Pigs invasion force gets either killed or captured. And it's an absolute disaster for the United States. They look completely foolish, and they look inept, and they look, terrible. And so JFK publicly takes the blame and says that this is on me. I approved the mission, and, we miscalculated. This is my fault. So publicly he takes the blame, but then behind the scenes, he puts the blame on Dulles. He puts the blame on Allen Dulles and begins to try and negotiate a way to remove Dulles from the director of the CIA, and put someone else in. And so he doesn't do it immediately. It kind of like grows, this kind of movement of his grows over time. But eventually he does axe Dulles, or at least, Dulles may have resigned, but he may have just been, kind of forced out the door. But this is a major, major deal for Allen Dulles. He has been the director of the CIA since, the first Eisenhower administration, has been, I think, director of the CIA for 9 to 10 years at this point, and has overseen, basically the Cold War foreign policy of the United States. He was remained very involved with the Council on Foreign Relations, and was a major figure in the Council on Foreign Relations, and represented a lot of, that organization's interests while in the CIA. So it's, he had allies, to say the least, who were also kind of enraged at his removal from the CIA. What Operation Mongoose is so even though the Bay of Pigs was a disaster, at this point, JFK was still supportive of removing Castro from power. So he handed operations over to his brother, Robert Kennedy, and Robert Kennedy began kind of running things during Operation Mongoose down in Florida. So he kind of became the point person for that. And so there's a really, not to get too ahead, but there's a famous quote from RFK when, he makes a phone call after his brother has been assassinated, and he's either told or, he just immediately becomes aware that he thinks it's like, quote unquote, one of our guys, because they were involved in training, some of these like Cuban hit squads that were, going after Castro. But what really shifts, so Dulles gets fired, but what really shifts JFK's opinion on Cuba is the Cuban Missile Crisis. And so that happens very shortly after. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, obviously, the Soviets send, nuclear missiles to Cuba because they're unhappy about the United States having nuclear missiles in Turkey and Italy that are within range of the Soviet Union. And I think it was like JFK had ordered those nukes to be taken out of Turkey, and the military is like I think the military just ignored him. Like they just kept them there. And so he was actually pretty angry when he learned of the rationale behind the Soviets putting nuclear missiles there, because he thought that he had, taken care of that. So anyways, the Cuban Missile Crisis is a terrifying time. And this whole time he's still supported by this, or he's still surrounded by this, military complex that is urging him to go to war. And so there are people in the United States military and in the CIA that want full scale confrontation with the Soviet Union in Cuba. And they want JFK to basically authorize an invasion of Cuba to handle, the Soviet threat. And again, he resists. There was Lemnitzer was, I think, the guy from the Pentagon that was in, his cabinet. And Lemnitzer was always, I think his name's Lyman Lemnitzer. And he was always trying to push, JFK into these kinds of confrontations with the Soviet Union. And again, he resisted. And again, he set up, the red line of communication with Khrushchev. It appears that the world came extremely close to nuclear war, like within minutes of, the button being, kind of pressed by, Soviet nuclear submarine.
There was an incident that happened there. There was a Soviet submarine that got instructions to send out the nukes. And if it wasn't for the Soviet captain questioning stuff, like, really? I'm really going to send that? Yeah, he waited, and it saved humanity. Like, literally, nobody knows this story. I forgot the Soviet Union, the Russian guy's name, but he's like, really? But like, you have to see this in the time of Strangelove and Curtis LeMay and all, and the Northwoods too in '62, I think.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, lots going on.
Yeah, and that's and I think it scares the bejesus out of JFK, and I think it scared Khrushchev too. And I think they, what happens afterwards is they begin to put, I think, a nuclear arms freeze on the development of new nuclear weapons. They negotiate some arms deal that begins to look more like a de-escalation, which is exactly the opposite of, like I said, that these war hawks and kind of, that were surrounding him wanted. And then he agrees during the negotiations of the Cuban Missile Crisis to basically to quit trying to oust Castro from power. That he'll shut down Operation Mongoose, and that he'll shut down any covert CIA operations aimed at either assassinating or, overthrowing Castro in some way. And once that happens, that's when the CIA, they had already turned against him. The CIA was full of Dulles loyalists. And so Dulles, even though he had been fired, the way that I've seen it described is that he continued to basically run the CIA out of his home. Because he's right there still in DC and Georgetown, constantly people like Angleton going over to his house to have meetings, people like, that were still involved. And I think even the new director of the CIA, McCord, I think his name's James McCord or McCone, I think it is. Yeah. He's a Department of Energy guy. Even he was in the Dulles camp as far as, kind of like CIA policy. So they had already turned against JFK after he had fired Dulles, but after he completely shuts down all the Cuban operations, and they've been working so hard for years, they really turn on him. And it becomes, kind of a vehement, violent opposition to him. And what I guess, a lot of kind of like, if you're looking at the Cuban aspect of the JFK assassination, and it's all of the hit squads that they had been training, all of the assassination squads, all of the, kind of operations that they had been running, turn from going against Castro to kind of turning inward and looking more towards JFK. And so, yeah, really that, like I said, I think when you begin to look at, I know you mentioned him earlier, but people like David Ferry, he was in New Orleans, kind of in the time where in New Orleans, so you have Florida and you have Miami as a hotbed of this anti-Castro Cuban activity. New Orleans was another place, given its proximity, right there to the Gulf. So New Orleans is another city where all of this, anti-Castro activity is happening. And you mentioned David Ferry kind of running guns and all of this stuff. But it's people like that you see spring up, kind of throughout this JFK research that are connected into Cuba. And I mentioned the Watergate burglars and kind of that whole thing as well. But it's like they show up in all of these places, and they also show up. I mean, David Morales is one of them, and he shows up at the RFK assassination.
His son just published a book, so
really
and he said Morales was saying, we got JFK, and what did he say? JFK in Dallas. Now we're going to get RFK in LA or something like that. And then he had a mysterious death that he took all his secrets to the grave. But apparently that guy was a real enforcer, tough guy, like a real tough guy, not like a guy who thought he was tough, but really beat people up and pistol whip them and stuff.
Yeah, that's what he was. He was large, and he was. He liked to drink, and so when he would drink, he would become violent. But he would also, he had that quote after he had been drinking, and I think it was like, we quote unquote is like, we got that son of a bitch, didn't we? When they were talking about JFK, and so it was, kind of one of these things that's.
His son used to follow me on Twitter. I got to see if he still follows me.
Yeah,
because I've mentioned him before. Because like you said, there's all of these characters like Sturgis, Ferry, Morales, real tough guys. I mean, Hunt had like 27 kills or something like that. Like that's what he said. How many people he killed? Shackley, the blonde ghost, is all over the place.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because. And so just take like one of those people like David Ferry. So, and then you begin to see all of these connections between Cuba and Oswald. So that's the next place that Cuba becomes, super important, is because especially like later towards the Oswald story, like really as you get closer, and closer to the assassination when he's in Dallas, like he becomes closer to Cuba. But even when he was 16 or 17 in the Civil Air Patrol, David Ferry was his commander at the Civil Air Patrol. And David Ferry was known for doing things like dosing the Civil Air Patrol with hallucinogenic drugs.
Really? I didn't know that.
Yeah, I think it's tough to like track some of that down, but David Ferry was an insane character. And I think, some of it, I did watch, JFK, Oliver Stone recently, and that depiction of Ferry, I think has a lot of influence on how we kind of view him. But trying to get, back into who he was just an insane character. Really kind of like a caricature who, like, I think maybe even, I can't remember if we talked about him during Puharich. I've talked about him, through some of this other stuff, but he was one of the, a wandering bishop in those Eastern Orthodox Catholic,
it's like a fake. It's a fake like church. It's not authorized by Catholicism or Orthodoxy, but it sounds like, so if you get defrocked by them, you can still keep your ties. It's an important thing for Catholics, like, is to
and it was an intelligence, it was an intelligence network, and it was talk about it in reference to Lavenda, because Lavenda got caught up in some of the same network when he was up in New York. And so
I think Lavenda said he was wearing his fake frocks when he went to the RFK memorial in '68 or something like that.
Yeah,
which is, I mean, I won't say that, but it is interesting that a lot of these other guys who are in these traveling monk orders are in intelligence. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. And so
Ferry was also into hypnotism. Like he would hypnotize the boy. I mean, he was like a polymath involved in cancer research.
Yeah.
Really a brilliant guy. But he liked 17-year-old boys or whatever, 16-year-old boys. That was his thing.
that's what so it was like, as the leader of the Civil Air Patrol, hypnotism in that era, maybe, it goes kind of hand in hand, especially when you're working in intelligence and stuff like that. It goes hand in hand with narcotics and, what they're the narco hypnosis, techniques that MK Ultra and stuff like that was
which is in the
developing.
background of all the stuff. Dulles is the guy who's rubber stamped or stamped every
Yes.
year to start.
Yeah, and that's
he was supposedly, the rumor is, I haven't found this out if anybody confirmed this, but the person who allegedly trained Ferry was William Joseph Bryan, who I just keep talking about here and there. So he was another traveling monk. He also had that thing. And then if you read, go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to ask, was he like the one who was like almost 400 pounds?
Yeah, massive.
Yeah. Okay.
Easily I know exactly over 300 pounds. Medical doctor, lawyer, friends with Melvin Belli, who was the attorney for Ruby, who's also involved in gun running to all over the place, actually. I think Israel and Cuba.
And he was served as a consultant to, it was Project Artichoke and that Puharich that we talked about, and it was Morse Allen so you had Sidney Gottlieb running it was the technical service staff, and they were running MK Ultra, and then parallel to them, it was the Office of Security, and Morse Allen were running Project Artichoke, and there was a lot of overlap, but that was what, Artichoke was a joint CIA Army project, while the MK Ultra was, they may have worked some with the Army, but
it's very important to understand that, because a lot of stuff happened before the CIA get involved. People have the CIA tunnel vision.
And Morse Allen was Office of Naval Intelligence. He was a long time, not just for World War II. He was Office of Naval Intelligence back into the 30s, maybe even the 20s. And so that was, everyone talks about the OSS, but you have to look at some of those Army intelligence and naval intelligence, because they were the first ones that conducted the hallucinogenic experiments. I think it was through Chatter, maybe, but it was like 47 is already when they were doing some of that stuff. And so, it was,
I would say in American post-war history, the military has done a great job of pushing all conspiratorial blame onto the CIA and washing its hands all the time. Yeah, they do it all the time. They're heavily involved in the JFK assassination. LeMay, Lansdale, Lemnitzer. There's so many people around. The other guy who was like dudes in the bathroom who Oswald supposedly shot at him. What was that guy's name? Do you remember?
Oh my God. Can't remember.
And then he got busted for like being a bathroom marauder with dudes, but he's fully right wing. I forgot his name. Anyway, these guys are all over the JFK assassination. LeMay is supposedly in the autopsy room smoking a cigar, just like really like gloating over it. He's depicted in Stone's JFK movie too.
Okay. Yeah, and that's what, and this is, like I said, kind of focusing on, the Dulles angle, and that's naturally the CIA one, but obviously the JFK assassination isn't going to be explained by just looking at, Alan Dulles and some of that stuff. But getting back to Oswald and some of that stuff. So maybe Ferry had kind of like introduced Oswald into, maybe some hypnosis or some narco hypnosis, something like that. He joins the Marines. He ends up at the base in Japan. Is it in Asuga? I forget.
Atsugi, which is outside of Tokyo. So it's basically a suburb of Tokyo.
And this is where the U-2 spy plane program was really being run out of, one of the most secretive operations in the United States military at the time, also a site of MK Ultra type research. And so I just mentioned that touch point with Ferry because Ferry shows back up and, basically at the assassination, or at least, right up to the assassination in New Orleans. And he's, all the way 8 years before, he's the Civil Air Patrol leader for Oswald, into narcotics, into hypnosis.
There's a famous picture of them together. I'll see if I can find it.
Yeah. Oswald then goes to a military base that was known for narco experimentation on U.S. forces. And he begins acting very strangely. He begins expressing an extreme, allegedly, uninterest in communism and the theories of communism. and really kind of getting into conflicts with his fellow soldiers because of his, sympathy towards communism in the Soviet Union. Yeah, there's that picture. Is that at the Civil Air Patrol? Yeah.
Look at where Ferry is standing behind that dude, man. That is
And he had
pretty questionable, I would say.
he had been like one of the things that had kind of like why he goes into this super strange underground is I think he had been caught engaging in homosexuality probably while he was in the military or something, and had been chastised for that, and so that was kind of like
his records. James Day has done a lot of research on him. I'll get you in touch with Day because he talked to somebody about Ferry recently, but his records, Ferry's records, indicate that he had trouble when he was a Catholic priest. He was a Jesuit, right? But they didn't say you were gay back then. You said you'd some euphemism like you had emotional problems, or they covered it up.
Yeah.
I don't think the Catholic Church covers that stuff up anymore because they had too many problems. But like back in the days, they would just say the guy was emotionally unstable, and then they kick you out, and that's what happened to Ferry.
Yeah, and that's what, and in the Oliver Stone's JFK, he mentions that several times where he just wanted to be a Catholic priest, but his homosexuality is depicted in that, along with whoever was Clay Shaw that was there. But yeah, I mean, it's just super, like with Oswald being caught up at like being in all of these strange places, and then he defects. So he, I think he either shoots himself intentionally or accidentally shoots himself in the hand or something, and
he has strange access to money while he's the next Sugi. Like he's able to go out and party at clubs and spend money on women and things like that, where he has strange income. So he has some other strange source of income for some reason.
And he shows up at that money shows up while he's defecting to the Soviet Union as well. He was able to stay in some of the nicer hotels. He was like stopped off in like Finland or Sweden or something.
Helsinki, I think.
And was able to stay in like the nicest hotels in Helsinki. And it was like, how is he getting this money? He didn't have a job before that. He was poor in the Marines, 18, 19 years old. Renounces his citizenship in a seemingly kind of scripted, staged fashion at the embassy, and then is allowed to freely kind of enter the Soviet Union without seemingly much like resistance from the KG. Like, he offered to give the Soviet Union secrets about the U-2 spy program. And it's interesting because I think they shot the U-2 spy plane while he was there. I think like that incident in which the Soviet Union actually got, was able to like discover what was happening. I think may have happened while he was there, but there was not. It's really murky, his time over in the Soviet Union. I don't think like it's difficult to kind of parse out exactly what was going on, but he was like maybe perhaps connected into both of the intelligence communities in the United States and in the Soviet Union in some way.
It was Harvey's guy's the name. I couldn't remember last time. Was Paul Harvey, an attorney who like handled stuff. Oswald was special, man. There was something very weird about him. The fact that he could kind of come and go and supposedly defect and then get back in the U.S. during the whole Cold War, no less, right? So it's like, oh yeah, come on back. Work for fair play for Cuba. Go ahead.
And that's what I mean is he comes back with no real resistance, which is strange. Like, if an American citizen renounces their citizenship and, talks trash about the United States and is in support of the Soviet Union in the early 60s, it seems like there would be more attention paid or, some more conflict around his return. But he was able to return. He returns with Marina Oswald, his wife. And then, they end up in Dallas. And then he also ends up visiting, New Orleans frequently. And, just kind of tying it into the Cuba, his office. So he tries to, I think, join the Cuban exile like student group down in New Orleans, and they think that he's weird, and they don't really like let him join. And then a week later or something, like later in the week, he's out handing pro-Castro pamphlets out to people in the street, causing a scene, being like pro-communist. And so it's like, he's kind of trying to like play both sides, or trying to organize this conflict. And he puts out the address of Camp Street, on his Fair Play for Cuba, or the I think it's the Fair Play for Cuba committee, or whatever office he was running the pamphlets out of. That office that he puts on there shared an office with Guy Bannister, and Guy Bannister was the guy who had kind of been in contact, I think, with David Ferry. Was very close with him, and Guy Bannister was, I think he was FBI.
He was high up in the FBI.
Yeah,
he was the head of the FBI office in Chicago, where all the mobsters were. So he's right under Hoover. He's like a 33rd degree Mason, or Order of the Jesters. Like, he's got all these secret societies, and he's involved in the UFO stuff. Like, he's part of the UFO sighting. Like, you cannot write this stuff. It's incredible.
Yeah, he was the quote unquote, the real X-Files started with Bannister, and it started with, the Kenneth. There were a couple different sightings in Washington State, but he was, I'm pretty sure, the one that responded, to the Kenneth Arnold sightings, and there's a whole bunch of stuff with that. So again, and then it's like he shows up down there.
Sorry to interrupt. One more thing though, but Bannister was the character witness when Ferry got sued by TWA. So he actually showed up and said, "Oh, Ferry's a really nice, great guy," which Ferry wasn't really. He was a predator, man. He liked teen boys. And he ended, I mean, you want to talk about the gall or chutzpah or whatever, but like Ferry, then he got brought up on like an internal investigation. We have all the records. They're all available with Bannister involved. And then Ferry countersues and wins, and TWA pays him out, even though he was up to no good. Like, he had a whole secret life. And then the other people in the cap is like Dave Adler. What is it? What's the guy's name who dealt all the drugs? Like, these people are all in the same thing, like the same orbit. Barry Seal, sorry, Barry Adler Seal. All said by Hopsicker, both CIA agents, by the way.
Yeah,
Barry Seal and Ferry. The day of the JFK assassination, Ferry was in court with Trafficante or whatever, one of these guys. So he's friends with Bannister, Trafficante. Garrison talks about seeing him on the street, and Ferry's like harassing him. And then there's a communication between Ferry and like Garrison's guys where he's kind of mocking them because he knows what's going on, but they have no idea. And he didn't end up dead until the real Garrison investigation kind of got started. So that's what I think probably led to his unfortunate demise.
Yeah, I think he was definitely the loosest end on that New Orleans investigate. I think that was probably, kind of the easiest target. I mean, obviously they like go after Shaw, but it's, they never really had any hard evidence. But I think Ferry would have been the one that they may have been able to kind of, may have enlightened, some of the situation had they been successful. And,
I think these guys are either brought up, they're going to be like investigated, or they're going to be asked questions, and then they turn up dead. Like the same thing happened in the 70s too. Like, whoa. Yeah.
When they kind of reopen it after that. So it's just that connection, and that's what, this Fair Play for Cuba. And the other thing that happens that connects him into Cuba is so he's reported, I think, by either the FBI or the CIA or both, as having gone down to Mexico City and tried to either defect to Cuba or like go into Cuba. And what the investigations end up revealing is that it wasn't his, like, so they supposedly had a phone call from Oswald to the Cuban embassy talking about either defection or, some sort of like pro-communist thing that he wanted to do. And the FBI reviewed the tape, and they concluded that it was not his voice, that it wasn't Oswald actually speaking. And so it was a CIA, seemingly kind of a CIA operation to make it appear as if Oswald was working with the communist Cuban government, not the, Cuban exile. And that's probably why he was handing out those pamphlets, is they were trying to cultivate that image of Oswald being pro-communist Cuban, pro-Castro.
And if I remember, one of the key elements of the Garrison trial was Oswald hanging out at like a medical facility with Shaw and Ferry in the car. Like, I think that's what that guy who's depicted by Kevin Bacon was like. So I forgot what his name. He had like Gallo or something like that. But that was like the key thing, that like, okay, so Oswald really isn't some kind of independent communist guy. He's hanging out with a guy we're investigating for the murder. Shaw, by the way, is alleged to be a Knight of Malta, like Dulles.
Interesting.
Which is really incredible. I couldn't confirm Shaw was a Knight of Malta, but I know that in the war he got a lot of very high-end honors by the French government, because he worked under the guy who was the military guy, another military tie, by the way, the military guy who oversaw Operation Overlord, which was the invasion of France in June 44. And it really established his bona fides. Like, he made his bones in the military. He really was a military guy.
Yeah, and that's what it's interesting that you mentioned, the French, kind of the French government, and that's one of the things that I've been trying to look into a little bit more. Is it's H.P. Albarelli's coup in Dallas, and he opens with I think his name was Pierre Lafitte, and he talks about the stay behind networks that were organized in countries like France and Italy, and the kind of assassination squads that they had been training there all the way back to like the resistance to the Nazis. But even after that, talking about I mean, it kind of is a very like Scorsese is involved in like a lot of these kind of trainings, and so even though it's may have started as kind of like in the resistance during World War II, like in the resistance to the Vichy government, after World War II, it really takes kind of a turn, like vehemently anti-communist and, pretty much fascist. Through
real fascism, like real honest to God fascism, the Cirque and things like that, which interestingly popped up in the Kirk thing. There was somebody said something about, and these are like high-end financing for a lot of stuff. The Cirque to perm index and all this stuff like that. Like, it's the murky, it's really a fascist. I mean, I'm not using that term in like the left's use of the term, where like they use it in the sense that if you see a group of guys with guns and leather shoes marching together, that's their idea of fascism. But it's not what I would say. It's like an ideological view, or like a imaginative view. The real textbook view of fascism is a fusing of the government and the corporations together. That's really what it is.
And that was a lot of that was happening in Spain. And so I think it was like in the Albarelli book, he was mentioning like L'Oreal, that, I think it was the makeup manufacturer. And it's just like, this massive name, but they were hiring, some of these just absolute, I mean, they were just thugs, they were trained professional assassins. And, this was the network that was trying to, I think, assassinate de Gaulle. And so de Gaulle, when it's like some of those people start to show up around the JFK assassination, I think de Gaulle realized that it was perhaps some of the same network, this international, it was an international, Cold War network, committed to kind of like, fascism and, assassinating political leaders in this way. And so that whole angle is really interesting. So it goes, and Dulles was involved, in all of that. He was involved in organizing, those stay, helping to organize those stay behind networks, and organizing their activity throughout, the CIA. I mean, Italy was crucial to the United States and to the CIA as not falling to the communists, so it was, even though de Gaulle was antagonistic a lot of times towards the United States, they were extremely committed to, fighting communists with these networks that we mentioned. And so Dulles, it's you get into all of these connections and you get all of these people, and all of them do, tie back to Dulles. And I guess it's like when kind of viewing his, he had motive in the JFK assassination. And a lot of people have motive. It's an interesting quote. I forget who said it, but it was, when they said JFK arrived in Dallas that day, that he was the most murdered man in history, that it was, there were both significant people and institutions that were, aligned against him. And Alan Dulles was certainly one of the most major figures in that whole, kind of anti-JFK sphere. And he was very coy about the JFK assassination, kind of when asked about it. I mean, he gave a very, kind of spooky answer. I think we mentioned that kind of the last time, but it was, not obviously admitting, denying it, but it's a very, kind of
What did he say? I don't recall. What was it?
It was just, I think it was being interviewed like towards the end of his life, and he was strolling, and I forget exactly, I forget the exact quote, but it was a very tongue-in-cheek denial. It was kind of like what, you mentioned how a lot of people were kind of gloating over, kind of JFK's assassination. David Morales was bragging about it. There's, the man you mentioned in, the autopsy. So it was like he was.
Curtis LeMay was a real, it's another show in itself. He was a freaking maniac. He should have been put in a psychiatric hospital. He wanted to bomb everything. He bombed freaking Japan, Korea. It's like almost like he was part of like it's Strange Love, and bragged about it. There's a Sanders, but Ed Sanders, I forgot the name of it, but like he moved to LA and he's like, yeah, we're gonna get RFK next. Like he would say that to people, before RFK. It's not funny. People get angry at me laughing about this stuff, but it's like this is the real history.
It's just so absurd that I definitely understand that reaction, because there have been times where it's like you said, where it's like you'll just learn, like, David Ferry.
It's like
you just learn some facts about it.
It's like the Epstein stuff. I'm sorry, I don't.
Yeah,
I wrote, if you don't laugh, you cry. It's so bad. Like the government should have already arrested all these people around Epstein. All right, it's totally unjust. So
yeah, that's what we've been talking about that over on our podcast, on Bad Press, and we did a whole series on that, and it's another it's just baffling, and it's in its extent where you're just I was just talking about the sheer scope of connections. It was like, even before this file release, it was like I would just look up like Epstein connections to the scientific community post 2008 arrest, and it's just, the list goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. Like, it's just staggering. And that's just one component of it. That's not even considering the financial sector. That's not considering, any of these other interests that he was involved with. So yeah, it's just,
he was similar in nature. Influence agent. There's no question about it. And not a good one. And really involved in political places. Like he was, if you read his interior emails and stuff, he's involved in other countries and other foreign leaders and wanting certain people deposed, and like the opportunities in Ukraine. So all these parasites, all these jackals that looked at this whole death and everything in Ukraine as a revenue stream. It's crazy. Like, wow. Like, that's not funny. Like, don't get angry at me that they did it. Gosh. Like, I don't care. I bet people get angry at me about everything, but it just shows like these guys, Dulles is around. One of the Dulles things about Alan Dulles in the giveaway is he is instrumental in the cover-up. Absolutely. That's like the real tell about Dulles. And also, you mentioned the Talbot book, and I remember the Devil's Chessboard does have something in there by Talbot where he showed that Dulles was at the JFK compound. No, excuse me, at the CIA. They called it the farm. It was kind of an adjunct of the CIA, and he was there.
Yeah, he's
during the JFK assassination. Excuse me.
Yeah, and
on November 22nd, 1963.
Yeah, he was like he was pretty notorious for like traveling on the day of a huge CIA action. He would usually always be out of Washington, and then he would return after the event had actually. So he did this with Bay of Pigs. He was in Puerto Rico during Bay of Pigs, and then he gets back, and basically it's over. And he spends time. But then you're exactly right. I think he may have been like out of town, during the actual assassination, but then went for like 72 hours and was at the farm. And then obviously, everyone knows that he was on the Warren Commission. And he was really the one that steered the Warren Commission. So, it was named for, was his name, Earl Warren, Justice Earl Warren. But Earl Warren and Dulles was by this point had been aging too. He was definitely up there. He would have been in his, kind of late 60s. But Warren seemed not necessarily super thrilled to have the task of investigating the JFK assassination, whereas Dulles was very energetic. And he was the one making a lot of the behind the scenes move of, coordinating media coverage, coordinating congressional allies, and, kind of putting forward the narrative, obviously questioning witnesses, leading witnesses wherever he wanted, and excluding any mention of the CIA in the Warren report, excluding any mention that Lee Harvey Oswald had connections to, different intelligence organizations, or that they had been tracking him and, had been engaging with him. So you're right. I mean, he was the architect of the cover-up, the primary architect. And there were a lot of loose ends, and that was like, and it was, this is the thing, is that Dulles, for the most part, is ruthlessly effective in whatever he's doing. And so
his nickname was the Shark.
Yeah. And so while he is just like this, embodiment of evil, with that, there was, there were, if you were looking at like mistakes from his perspective, it was like he didn't leave a lot of room for mistakes. And the Warren report was, a blueprint for a government cover up. I mean, they did it when, Nixon couldn't. A few years later, he couldn't, and the rest of the CIA, they couldn't cover up, everything that happened at Watergate, that explodes in their face. But, for the time being, at the time, the Warren report, puts forward that narrative, and then as the it's used as the foundation, to undermine the rest of the investigations that, come up kind of throughout history. So yeah.
It's really incredible. There is an interesting tie between Dulles and kind of our current thing with Epstein, and it's a journalist by the name of Gordon Thomas. Have you ever heard his name?
Yeah, I've heard that name. Yes.
He wrote a book. It's titled, I recommend to you and the listeners to check this book out. You can find it on archive.org. It's called Journey into Madness, The True Story of Secret CIA Mind Control and Medical Abuse. And the interesting thing about him is that Gordon Thomas knew Dulles and was hanging out in DC. I think he was either the foreign correspondent for some UK group. And it's really remarkable. It shows his friendship with Ewan Cameron and all these guys in Helms, and they would have secret meetings, but also this kind of private diplomacy. They were part of the Georgetown set. Yep. And so was JFK. And a lot of these people were like, and a lot of those people died. Like, I forgot the woman's reporter name. She died mysteriously. The one that Mark Shaw writes about. Anyway, Gordon Thomas is right there and really having discussions, and they're talking about the Manchurian candidates and things like that in the mid 50s. And then Gordon Thomas kind of ties into the modern thing because he wrote about Robert Maxwell, whose original name was Abraham Laszlo. He changed it. Yeah. He anglicized his name. Really one of the great super spies. And I think his book is called Robert Maxwell, Israel Super Spy.
Yeah.
And it talks about his death. Like I think it's about the murder. So they allege his murder. And this is kind of not known. It was known that he was on a yacht in the Canary
Lady
Island.
Blaine.
Correct. Very good. And he supposedly slipped off. But in the Epstein files that just were released on Friday, the 30th of January, there's something from somebody. It's redacted. The public has to know this, who wrote this, because it says he was passed away. So it doesn't say he passed away in reference to Robert Maxwell. So it seems to be an inside news and a corroboration through Epstein and some of his contacts that they aced Maxwell. And then his daughter's with him. Daughter's with Jeff. And then I think Jeff, people are putting this out on the internet that Jeff got away and he's in Israel. I think they wasted him just like they wasted Maxwell. That's my opinion. So
that's what, the Maxwell. So, I mean, the one that seems to make the most sense to me is that the Mossad put a hit on him, because what happened with Maxwell is the it was there was a prosecution that happened in the United States that had to do with Iran Contra, and it had to do with the Mossad agent selling cargo planes, I believe, to Iran. And he was being tried in the United States by the Justice Department for sale of, foreign weapons, or, foreign
Is it Ari
materials.
Ben Menashe?
Yes, that's Ben Menashe. And then Ben Menashe was involved, or at least had knowledge about the Mordecai Vanunu kidnapping, the nuclear scientist who was blowing the whistle on Israel's nuclear program.
Timona.
Yes. And so Ben Menashe was able to prove in court that he worked for the Mossad. He was able to produce passports that proved that. And so he was acquitted, but he had been burned by Mossad because they didn't support him during that trial. They tried to leave him to hang, and they didn't admit that he was working for them. And then when it came out that he did definitely work for them, they said, oh, well, he was a low-level agent. He didn't do anything for us, blah, 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 blah. Classic story. Well, he went over to Great Britain after he was acquitted, and he started leaking all of these stories about Mossad's activities in the 80s to the British press. And Seymour Hersh, no one would publish it because obviously Maxwell, these allegations involved Robert Maxwell, because Robert Maxwell helped organize the Vanunu kidnapping in Rome. And so he had set up a honeypot because, Maxwell was a British intelligence agent, and he was also a Mossad intelligence agent, and he was probably a KGB agent, and he worked closely with the CIA. So a super spy in every sense of the word, but probably most active with the Mossad, especially in the 80s. And so the Mossad approached him. They had him organize the Vanunu. And then when he was taken back to Israel, Vanunu was put in prison for 18 years. And so he had the hammer dropped on him. And this is the types of stories that Ben Menashe was leaking to the press, but no one would publish it except for Seymour Hersh, because Seymour Hersh was able to use his contacts and able to corroborate, key elements of Ben Menashe's story. And Seymour Hersh published either a book or a journalistic series that outed Maxwell as a Mossad agent. And this was in the late 80s, early 90s. And so because it had been aired out in the press, and Maxwell sued him for libel, and Hersh won. And so Maxwell had to, kind of accept defeat. And it was weeks to months after that affair that he was probably targeted. I think Mossad is the one who took him out off the Lady Ghislaine. But they brought Maxwell to Israel, and they buried him on the Mount of Olives, and they had the prime minister and former prime ministers. There's a famous quote about him that was, Robert Maxwell has done more for Israel than today can be said. And so it was talking about how, kind of intimately he was involved. And then obviously, but that whole...
Those are only the stories we know, we don't know all the stories.
And Epstein's patron in the 90s, immediately following that, is Les Wexner. And Les Wexner joins with Charles Bronfman and creates the Mega Group, which is an Israeli political lobby. And Les Wexner signs over power of attorney to $5 billion to Jeffrey Epstein. And so he has, Epstein was involved in Iran Contra. I mean, it's those connections are.
He almost has unlimited funds. He was saying, I don't know how much truth is in there, but in these most recent drops, he's sending an email to somebody saying he's an investment representative for the Rothschild fund worth $160 billion. So I'm not saying he has access to it, but he can finance stuff. And it's clear he's financing people and throwing around money that to average person is very consequential, 50,000 bucks here and there. For me, that would be life-changing, but he does it very casually, without a lot of, because I think he had constant income coming from his trafficking networks and whatever he was doing. He's clearly making money. There's a very shady thing. Interesting thing. Another connection to Gordon Thomas, that's kind of my point of bringing him up, is that he co-wrote the book with Martin Dillon. And Dillon, after Epstein died, Dillon sent me an email of what he thought about everything. And I read that into the record and I reposted it on my X. So if people want to listen to that episode, you can just go into William Ramsey Investigates and search for Dylan, like Tim Dillon, same last name, who co-wrote it with Gordon Thomas. But Gordon Thomas kind of, some of these writers and things like that, they've either just kind of faded into obscurity. But that book that he wrote about CIA is one of the more important ones, up there with Operation Mind Control and Search for the Manchurian Candidate, because he's talking about first person at the very inception in the 50s. So it wasn't like somebody looking back at all the research and stuff. Like he's literally talking to Dulles. It's really incredible.
That is incredible.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, because in tying in, I think British intelligence is extremely important, to that story, and British intelligence also with behavioral modification and behavioral control. And I was talking a little bit about this, and I think you said you've interviewed Recluse before. It's Stephen Snyder, but he wrote.
Yeah, I've done a bunch of his books and stuff.
Yeah, Trump and the Anglo-American establishment, and it's goes into a lot of, but he really focuses and hones onto like some of these British intelligence networks and kind of what they were doing over there. And obviously, there's the Maxwell thing that you were doing, but they were, extremely involved as well.
Here it is, guys. Journey into Madness. Check it out. That's what this is, kind of one of the lost texts. But this, we can go into some of the dullest stuff. Let me see if I could find some of this. Like, he's with all the MK doctors too, which is very uncomfortable, like Sargent and Cameron and stuff like that. Let me read. This is from page 103. Dr. Cameron brought with him another psychiatrist, an Englishman who reminded him that they had last met at the banquet given by the American Psychiatric Association. Dr. William Sargent mentioned in, what's the guy who said The Ultimate Revolution? It's, what's the writer? Who wrote Brave New World?
Oh, Aldous Huxley?
Aldous Huxley mentioned Sargent in that famous statement. The posted carried an item that was in town, medical conference. Just as the capabilities of other guests would have astounded her, she would have been amazed to learn that among his other skills, the strong-faced Dr. Sargent was regarded by her husband as Britain's leading medical expert on eliciting confessions. Nor, of course, did Clover know that Dr. Sargent did not approve of all the techniques of Dr. Cameron. Clover is Dulles' wife. But Clover was therefore surprised to see her husband, Alan Dulles, lead Dr. Wolf and Dr. Cameron to his den after arranging for another guest to give Dr. Sargent a lift back to his hotel. The two doctors were then joined by Dr. Monroe, Dr. Gottlieb, and Richard Helms. Can you imagine? Like, that's almost like a nefarious ultra criminal convention. Literally, you and Cameron, Sargent, Gottlieb, Helms, and Alan Dulles.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, it's terrifying. I'm not laughing, guys. Don't make fun of me.
Yeah, that's right.
Amazing knowledge. That's why you laugh.
And it's, and I think I mentioned it last time, but to reiterate the relationship between Dulles and Cameron and some of these other like MK Ultra doctors is he sent his own son to receive electroshock therapy and insulin shock therapy after his son sustained a head injury during the Korean War. And so it was like he knew the tactics, and he knew how barbaric it was, and the rest of his Clover knew how barbaric it was. And, the other, I think it was like maybe Dulles' daughter or something like that. It was, the one who kind of ended up taking care of her brother, getting him out of the United States. They got him over to Switzerland, and kind of away from, some of the more extreme things that were going on. But he was still conscious enough to, let his sister know or let his family know how horrific, his experience was. And so this is a man who sent his own son into the lion's den. That entire network, he oversaw.
Yeah, he sure did. He established it and was networked well in a personal level. That's interesting. There's other stories of him, like Gordon Thomas talks about Dulles and his like proclivities with the Georgetown set and Epstein type levels of girl trafficking. Like they're just, it's not good. It's not good. Do you have time to take a couple comments?
Yes, please. I got all the time we need.
Gonderstein. William, you do great work. I appreciate you a lot about one of your books. Thanks. Thank you very much. My books are available on William Ramsey Investigates. Frank says, mob protected the waterfronts during the war. Lucky had an extensive map of the war on his cell wall. Yes. Says it's horrible in Cuba right now. Cuba was the first Las Vegas for the mob. Yeah, I think you're right. Everything there, like money laundering, stuff like that. Hey, South Tower West. Welcome, Tara. Some of these people show up on all my streams, so I'm just saying hi to them.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Maybe that's why Alan Dulles wanted revenge. I think so. He had a lot of reasons to do that. Israel whacked JFK. They might have been involved, but they didn't have an involvement in the cover-up. But I think everybody wanted JFK dead. Honestly, I think he was kind of like a sacrificial lamb or something. Yitzhak Rabin was in Dealey Plaza. I did not hear that. Lucien Sarti, Grassy Knoll, French Corsicans. Not surprised. They usually bring somebody from outside of the country because they can do that stuff. They don't have any connections to the people, which is why you see all those weird planes flying around when Charlie Kirk died, because they don't care. They don't know who Charlie Kirk is. It's just another person.
Yeah.
Regard, William, are you blaming Catholics for whacking JFK? Give me a break. This is just the kind of nonsense people make up. We were talking about a non-Catholic group. It's actually for people who get kicked out of the Catholic Church. These fake Orthodox orders and stuff like that. It's like saying there's like a fake Knights of Malta. There's all kinds of fake groups. That's what these guys would do. That's what Ferry did.
And what's worth noting that JFK was the first and perhaps probably only Catholic president. And this was actually many people, especially kind of related to the neo-Nazi movement and, kind of some of these other nefarious organizations in the South and that were extremely present around Dallas, had a lot of anti-Catholic sentiment. And so, I don't think, necessarily the Catholics would have wanted to, get rid of JFK. That doesn't seem likely, but, I think
Israel. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, thanks, Regard. I don't believe the whole Israel whack JFK thesis. Sorry, I don't believe it. Any connections between Dulles brothers had to McGeorge Bundy? I think he was a key player in Vietnam. Bartow asked. Do you have any ideas about that?
Yeah, Bundy was in his cabinet, or I'm sorry, it was in the cabinet of JFK, and I think was actually pretty close with JFK. But after. So, I mean, it seems like I think Bundy was kind of an ally, but then once JFK was assassinated, very few people from his administration ever spoke up or, even like actively wanted kind of an investigation. So Bundy, I think does go on to play, a huge role in kind of the Vietnam War, but that's another justification that we didn't really talk about, is JFK appeared to be kind of trying to de-escalate tensions in Vietnam, going against the kind of military industrial complex. But also there's stuff that came out in the Pentagon Papers where he kind of scaled up activity in Vietnam. So it's a complicated situation, but he is definitely he's in a lot of these rooms, with JFK and Dulles and, allies of both of them. So
I think McBundy is Skull and Bones too, if I remember. Dorothy Kilgallen, that's right, Bartow. That's the one who was around Ruby, and then she ended up dead. They eat their own. There's some really dark stuff inside. It's interesting too, because I just read one last night of these guys and Jimmy Savile in New Orleans. Like there's a statement. It's not like testimony in court, but there was a statement to the FBI that Savile's hanging around with the Epstein network, which makes perfect sense to me. Make a video of the ISIS that attacked the airport in Niger. This is relevant now. Attacked February 1st. I'm not aware of that. Tara asked, do you have to do is read the JFK files that have been allowed to us? Do you have to do? Well, yeah. All you have to do is read the JFK. I think so. There's a lot of files available now. A lot of great work is still going on.
Yeah, I think the public record, I mean, what public investigation is done by, a lot of independent journalists is incredibly valuable. I think we have maybe not the final picture, but I think we have an okay, but it's a lot. So it takes a really long time to engage with and understand. And I'm very far away from, doing anything like that, but it's fascinating.
Telegraphic asks, are you familiar with dark journalist theory on the aerospace actors behind the JFK murder? Oswald's co-workers at Riley Coffee went to NASA shortly before the Dallas event. Do you have any thoughts on that, Dave?
I mean, I've definitely seen, I'm not familiar exactly with dark journalist theory. I've seen, kind of some talk about it, and how the UFO thing kind of plays in. I think the U-2, kind of somehow the U-2 spy planes kind of plays into that story. It's strange that Guy Bannister, we mentioned him as kind of being connected to the UFO question, how he shows up, super prominently in there. And then obviously when you're talking about kind of like the UFO conversation, a lot of what you're talking about is like the military industrial complex, and the military industrial complex is massive in Dallas. And so it would not surprise me kind of at all, if some of those, like, some of that is true. I don't know, it's difficult to say of, why JFK, for what specific reason was he murdered. But I would not be surprised at all if, that those narratives exist. And there's some, kind of weird, spooky behavior, from the CIA, with Bannister or FBI. I guess he was FBI, but, and then, also, like I said, kind of the military industrial complex with, kind of whatever projects they were working on. So I think it's a really interesting angle. I haven't looked a lot into it though.
I think it was personal. I think he was fighting against their agenda and all their, people, and people died at the Bay of Pigs, and he didn't seem to, I think he was naive. He was a young guy, so died at 42. So I don't think he knew that he was in this like wilderness of mirrors and intrigue and what really was maybe going on behind the scenes. He had, I don't know, it's my speculation, but it just seemed like maybe he didn't know the gravity of what he was involved in. Maybe he did.
Yeah, it seemed to me like he kind of got glimpses, but I don't think that he thought the response would be. I think he thought he had enough political capital to win a second administration, and that he would have enough political will to really do what he wanted to do in that second administration. But it was I don't think he expected the response to come, in the way that it did. So yeah, I think a little bit of naivete. And then what's even spookier than that is RFK basically knew that he was going to die. A lot of people kind of just described him as kind of a dead man walking when he, declared his presidential bid.
Interesting.
So it's
there. If you read James Douglas, who wrote JFK and the Unspeakable, there are sequences within there where JFK seems to have kind of a death wish, like his famous poem, like the poems he liked were very morbid, and like things like that. Like, it's a great book. I mentioned that because James Douglas came out with a new book. I wonder if he does interviews. I don't know. I haven't heard him out on the interview circuit, but yeah, we're at the 90-minute mark. Dave, is there anything you'd like to add? Anything I missed before we wrap it up?
No, I don't think so. Like I said, I mean, it's huge topics. So it's, not going to be, probably not going to satisfy people who are super well read. But like I said, I mean, I think it's worth, kind of worth mentioning. And then, there's a lot of things that you threw out there, like the Knights of Malta. That's super interesting. I need to kind of I need to look more into that. I need to learn a whole lot more about,
the good news is I've done a lot of shows on the Knights.
I know.
Of Malta,
I have a whole queue.
All that stuff. It's an incredible organization. You want to talk about a supranational organization that's been extant longer than some whole nations have been extant. It's the Knights of Malta. Like, how long has the German state really been around? Like, not that long. Like, I think only like 150 years or 200 years. Like, the Knights of Malta is millennial. It's 1,000 years old with a very strong Christian tradition. Like, it's really something else.
Was it evolved out of just like, I know we're out of time, but was it evolved out of the Knights? Okay, was it Knights Hospitaller?
It's
that
different.
It's different.
Their
Okay.
full title is the Knights of St. John
Okay.
of things. They bounce between the Holy Land at like 1000 to they went to, what's the island there just south of Turkey? It's not Corsica, it's
Crete.
yeah, one of those. It kind of, and then they ended up in Malta. They were given something by the Holy Roman Empire to be in Malta, but they have a long kind of name.
Yeah.
But it's basically, it's based on Saint John the Baptist. That's their kind of patron saint.
Okay.
They're actually a very great charitable group. Like they do a lot of charitable works, feed the poor, heal the sick. They're also run by, there's some pretty sinister characters in the Knights of Malta. Knights of Malta, like Himmler, Dulles, Jimmy Savile. Like, how do these people get in there?
Yeah.
So it's supposed to be a Christian group.
Yeah.
Yeah, here's the full name: Magister Templi, Sovereign Military Hospitaller Order of St. John of Jerusalem, Rhodes in Malta. So they bounced from the Isle of Rhodes to Malta.
Okay.
But they were kind of like very anti-Muslim, and they were pirates. They literally would piracy against Muslim ships and stuff, and do all kinds of crazy stuff for years, for literally centuries. But it's another backstory of this, of like the secret societies and the connections, and what really Intel kind of plays out is like a lot of these guys have like incredible secrets. Like they're not in just one secret society; they're in like 20 different orders.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fascinating.
You are a publisher and a podcaster. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a Substack, which is Hemispheric Press, and we also have books. I am an editor, so if anyone is interested in writing a book, they can either get in contact through the Substack, or you email me at editor@Hemispheric Press. I really like working with different authors. And then we have our podcast is called Bad Press. It's kind of an extension of the publishing company, where we talk about stuff like this. We talk about, like I said, Epstein. We'll be kind of talking more about JFK in our next couple episodes. So yeah, please check us out. If any of this has been interesting to you. We're still very new, still very small. So, it's kind of,
you got to start somewhere. Hemispheric Press editor, and then also Bad Press is David Smith. And this was part 2 of the Dulles brothers. Were really incredible. Like there's a lot of books out there. This is kind of like you said, like you can get as deep as you want on the Dulles brothers, because they're all over the place. They really left their mark on 20th century history. And I don't know all that positive. Maybe if you're positive, like building the American empire, they did a great job of it. So
that's goes back to that ruthless efficiency. I mean, if you support what they were doing, then they're phenomenal advocates for Sullivan and Cromwell, and kind of elite corporate interests and stuff like that. But I would say for the average person, a very sinister figure in very sinister figures in American Cold War history.
Yeah, I agree with that. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it as well.
Likewise. Stay there.